both, Professor Anatol Lieven, Professor Adil Najam. This is our second talk as part of the ThinkFest conversations, and I'm very delighted and indeed excited to have both of you here on board, and I look forward to a very important and exciting conversation. So let me just start with the usual introductions. Neither of you needs much introduction. Professor Lieven is a professor at Georgetown University at Qatar. He's also a fellow of the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and is known for his work in international relations, I would say strategic studies, the author of a very well-known book in Pakistan, a Hard Country. And if I may dare say, this is a venture in a new direction for you, Professor Lieven, and you explain why you thought this was essential, and we'll get to that in a moment. Professor Adil Najam is the Dean of the Pardee School for Global Studies at the Boston University. He has been a Vice Chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He is a fellow of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, has been decorated in Pakistan with the highest honors, and really there's only so much that needs to be said about him. So let me then get going with the conversation that we're going to have. Professor Lieven, your book is not the usual environmentalists' work. You come to this topic from a particular background. You look at it from a security perspective, and you find, if I'm correct in saying so, that we are really not winning this battle against climate change. There is a very serious situation that humankind faces today, and what humankind has been doing, both in terms of, if you like, suppression or mitigation, or in terms of preparing for a potential future going forward, is inadequate, and there's some lack of clarity on both sides. Even the green movement itself often overloads its agenda, as you point out, with objectives which really are perhaps best left to a future time after we've won the battle against climate change. Is that a fair summary, would you say?
Yes, but absolutely. I mean, I became convinced by the evidence, including, of course, the evidence of the IPCC, to which Dr. Najam has contributed so prominently, of the extreme danger of climate change, if it is not limited, to the future of humanity, the future of modern civilization. And I'm afraid that the evidence, yes, has been that so far, I mean, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that so far we have not done enough, nearly enough, to meet this challenge. And even when agreements have been reached, so often the targets have not been met. And that has been true of, I think, not every country in the world, but certainly a majority of the key players. And then, of course, as we all know, sadly, on the part of the United States, there has been a backsliding. I mean, there is massive denial of climate change in America. And it's not, of course, just a question of Donald Trump, although his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement was indeed a bad move.
If I can just stop you here for a moment. We lose your voice when you move to a particular angle. It's fine, and then suddenly we lose you in the middle of it.
Is this better?
This is fine now, yes.
Okay, I'll try and stay close to the screen. And in the United States, denial of climate change and even those who don't deny it, opposition to action against climate change has come to characterize by far the greater part of the Republican Party. You know, one of the two parties in the United States. So it seemed to me that, therefore, I mean, if you really do take climate change seriously as a threat, we have to think seriously about what new strategies, political strategies, we can adopt in order to bring about action. I should say, by the way, that this in no way indicates opposition to international agreements, to international cooperation. But the thesis of my book is that in the end, action will have to be taken by states. States sign up to international agreements, but it is states that have to implement them. I think we have been very much reminded of that by the coronavirus pandemic crisis, about the centrality of state action. And the other thing, I point out in the book, as of course quite a number of people have pointed out, that if you count the European Union as one bloc, which I suppose we can still do, almost 2/3 of emissions in the world are accounted for by a handful of leading countries. And so it's really a question of convincing the political establishments and the security establishments of these countries that climate change is not just a threat to humanity, but is specifically a threat to their countries, and indeed, in some cases, to their rule over their countries. So yes, that is the thesis of the book.
Right, and I think there's an important distinction to be made here between the threat to climate as a whole for the planet, what we call climate change, and pollution more generally. Often we lose sight of this very important distinction, to my mind. When we talk of climate change, we are talking of carbon dioxide emissions, methane, and essentially nitrogen dioxide. You can have sulfur emissions, but they don't really cause climate change. They're not gases that trap heat in the atmosphere of the planet. So we need to realize that at the end of the day, we can be doing all sorts of good things with respect to sulfur emissions and so on. And yet the climate change slide could be continuing unless we are focused on doing something about the greenhouse gases specifically. And as you rightly point out, it's really at the end of the day, 5 or 6 large economies that have to be on board. And if they're not on board, this battle can't really be won. So it's the US, clearly the EU, China, India, and perhaps Japan. So the largest economies really have to sign on and then follow that up with actions. Now that is where we have not been able to generate international action, even if we've generated a bunch of agreements, but action has been lacking. And if I could bring in Dr. Najam here on this, he has vast experience monitoring international agreements and international diplomacy. Dr. Najam?
Thank you, Salman, and thank you very much, Anatol, not only for your comments, but for the book, which is a very interesting, provocative book, including in the title. And I will say being provocative on climate change is no longer easy because there is so much written on it and so much talked about it that coming with a new idea or angle is more difficult, I think, which is to be celebrated in this book. The key interesting thing I think you do for me is bringing the word nationalism back in. And that can provoke, because my entire generation of students of climate change sort of grew up on this idea that climate is the quintessential global issue, right? So of all the things we call global finance, global trade, global terror, the first one to get that moniker was climate, because just scientifically, chemically, it is a global issue. And therefore, we have for 30 years constructed this idea that, that we need global solutions. And I think Anatol is exactly right. We have failed in doing that because the state in some ways was not taken seriously enough. The important thing, I think he mentioned this, is that I don't think, and check me if I'm wrong, please, he's not saying that the global aspect, that being national means just think about yourself and the global chemistry doesn't matter. But that the onus of action is still in the nation state, because fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have any example in all of history of actual global action. And if anything, we've seen that yet again with COVID. And that, I think, is the conundrum. in the conundrum in the following way of what I think he just also alluded to, that while there is clearly the action at the national level, while it is clear that a few nations, and now you should also include China and India in them, which are not rich enough, but which are certainly large enough, China also rich enough, that you can get 10 countries to do something and everything will act. But the climate justice problem, and this is what I would like to get more from Anatol, remains a global one, which is that if those 10 don't do it, then there is nothing at all that a Pakistan or a Vanuatu or a Bangladesh can do unto themselves. It is not a question where a nation can choose to solve it for themselves. And again, COVID is such a striking example of this. You can't build a wall large enough to keep the carbon molecule out. You cannot close airports and carbon won't come. To give you a little example, I'm sitting here in Boston, a Pakistani. If COVID wasn't here and I took my car and traveled to Canada next door, at the border, they would stop me and ask me for my passport. But the CO2 from my car doesn't need a passport. It doesn't have a little flag over it, right? That molecule is going to go and it's going to cause climate change in various places. Last point on this, the science problem of the climate justice. And I think this is the real crux of how we bring national action and global impact together, if we can, is that impacts do not correspond to emissions. So the impacts right now are far greater in South Asia, not because our emissions were greater, but because, as in everything else, climate also seems to favor the rich. Or at least focus much more on the poor, and that's the conundrum of this national versus global. But in principle, I have been very convinced through having been hurt, and Anatol has made a very compelling argument that action in the world we live in will have to come at the national level, and nations will need to understand that it is in my own national interest to solve this problem, because if I don't, it's going to come and hit me back. And again, maybe COVID is not a bad time to be talking about this.
Right.
Yes.
Clearly, what Anatol is saying is that nations and people have to realize and come together and rebuild their societies in more sustainable sorts of ways, in more inclusive sorts of ways. But ultimately, it has to be coordination at the global level. As you point out, and as Anatol has pointed out, the large economies, which are really the prime movers of climate change, have to come together. The Bangladeshis and the Pakistans cannot solve it on their own. So there is this dual play here. We need that national sense of urgency, as it were, in various key nations. And yet that national sense of urgency has to translate into global action. And Anatol rightly points out that one of the drivers of that global coordination effort might be the threat of mass migration. So there will be eventually, if things go where they're expected to go, unless we win this battle against climate change, one would expect migrations at a scale that we've not seen in the past. Now, that is something that should alarm countries in maybe Europe and possibly in the US as well, though they think they can build a wall to keep the Mexicans and all the others out. But ultimately, there are going to be large scale movements of peoples, maybe from Bangladesh into India, as Bangladesh's fragile ecology faces maybe a greater ingress of the ocean, and so on, the Bay of Bengal. So there is a real threat of mass migration, and that's something that Anatol talks about. Would you like to take that up further, Professor Lieven?
Yes, that is something. The issue of migration is one of the ways, in the medium term as opposed to the long term, the argument that I make, that especially to the Americans, but I also say something about the Russians in this regard and the Australians, that do not think that because you're rich, and in the American case, isolated by the oceans, that this is going to make you immune to the effects of climate change, that you can somehow buy your way out of this without doing anything about it. But I also, of course, make the point that so often in the debate, the issue of migration has been treated as if it is simply a question of people trying to move to the West. But actually, you mentioned India. Many of the countries which will be most deeply affected by the mass movement of people are not in the West. They are, in fact, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and of course, South Africa has faced a very serious issue of this kind. And I think that we have seen with the Rohingya crisis, and also, of course, with India's, India, of course, has a wall of its own against Bangladesh, and a very ferociously enforced one, that countries in other parts of the world are also not showing themselves, shall we say, very generous or accepting of large numbers of migrants, and will face really serious crisis if climate change does bring about increased mass migration. Of course, I say that if we fail to limit climate change and we get runaway climate change as a result, probably not till the next century or whatever, then of course the question of America trying to isolate itself will be completely ridiculous. If we move from 3 degrees to 4 degrees to 5 degrees, then no country in the world, no existing state is going to be able to survive this in the long run.
Okay. If I can come back to you, Adil, why do you think humankind has not been able to come up with the kind of international cooperation that we need? I mean, clearly the threat is something that sane people everywhere realize. And yet we see that with the US and the Republican Party, there is clearly a constituency that is working against the efforts to contain climate change. But elsewhere, globally, we see that we are really not meeting the targets almost anywhere. China has done quite a bit. It's invested a great deal into renewables, alternative energy. In fact, as the book points out, something like maybe 40% of the investment in the last 8-10 years into alternatives, renewable energy has come from China. And yet, these things seem to be somehow contingent add-ons. There's still not that central sense of urgency around the world. Why is that?
Yeah, you are exactly right. No one has. I mean, US is an easy poster boy, especially with Mr. Trump to beat on, and is clearly the worst, but it is everyone. It is the Europeans, it's the Chinese, it's the Pakistanis, it's the Indians. No one has taken this seriously. And why has humankind not come to look at it seriously? Because humans are not kind. Even this word we make, humankind, is kind of funny, because there's nothing in our history that tells us that we have been kind or that we have been smart, right? And the smart point is that because the short-term interest, and this is where I think the problematic of the title Anatol chooses is so important, right? Nations tend to think of their immediate self-interest. Right? All of international relations is based on this idea that if I do what is in my interest, you do what is in your interest, Anatol does what is in his interest, we will somehow come up with what is in all of our interest. Right? We know from economic theory that is not always true, which is why you need governments. And we know from international relations and issues like climate that that is not always true. And that's the problematic, right? The problem is that if we all just focus on our interest, will the common interest be lost? Now, his argument, which I agree with, is that we need to rethink our own national interest, both in the longer and medium term, because this migration will come and hit me. In fact, I would say it's not that it will, it is coming and hitting me. I agree with Paul Collier that we've already seen possibly a few climate-induced wars. And historically, we might have seen, he talks about Rwanda, right? Well before Salman, well before you and I figure out that we have a religious problem between us, there is an economic cause. And what we saw in Africa is you get a drought, I start losing water, I go into your territory. You are kind, you say, okay, I'll share a bit. Now the pressure goes more because of the drought, increases. And then you say, hey, get away. And suddenly we both realize that we have 300 years of some other problem. that we can fight over. This migration thing is very real. This is not going to be, and it's happening now. It is happening now, right? So let me give you a very small example. Migration in climate, and my argument has been for a number of years, we are, as Anatol said, we think of it as a sideshow, and we think of it wrongly. We think of it as refugees. This is not about refugee migration. It's not like one day climate happens and I am in trouble and I move from my village. It's going to be like what you saw with the Green Revolution, for example. Entire communities will hollow out because the livelihoods of lots of people will be in peril. And so I will move from my village to Karachi, right?
Yes.
Or from my village in Bangladesh to Dhaka. And when there isn't enough opportunity, I'll move to Calcutta. And then I might move to Australia. So what you see is this demographic pressure, and we are seeing this, and I keep saying, I'll give you this very small example. In Bangladesh, in the Sundarbans, right, we are seeing this already. We think of climate change and sea level rise as if cities will go under. I hope they won't. I hope we are smarter than that. There is a micromillimeter change in fresh water and salt water in the Sundarbans, in the mangroves, okay? You can't even notice it. But what that does is, because where fresh and saltwater meet moves away, the shrimp moves away. When the shrimp moves away, the villages across the coast that depend on the shrimp can no longer cultivate. And you are seeing migration of shrimp farmers from the Sundarbans into Dhaka, into Chittagong, putting that urban pressure, which is then going to move to Calcutta, which is then going to move across. And so what you start seeing is this different sort of demographic pressure. We've seen this before. We see this with technology. We see this with other things. But that is the nature. The fulcrum of this is, are nations capable of being able to define their national interest, in the longer term than the immediate 4-year of a government? Till now, the evidence, if I were to argue with Anatol, I would say, till now, the evidence is we have not been capable of that, right? And B, are nations capable of defining their self-interest as these threats that might come from far away in a time far off, right? Now, one of the things that might have changed is that climate change is no longer an issue of the future. Right? We no longer have the right to talk about climate as if it is something that will happen tomorrow, because you only have to have seen the smog in Lahore or the heat wave in Karachi to know that it is here, it is now, it is present, it is real. Right? Now the question is, can our security personnel, can our political paraphernalia understand this as a real threat to human as well as national security? I hope Anatol is right. The evidence till now is we are not smart enough.
We're not smart enough, but let me just throw in, Anatol, another angle here. You know, when I talk to people from the energy industry, and I tell them that, look, what you guys are doing, the fossil fuel that you're pulling out of the earth is really going to lead to disaster, and it's going to lead to mass migrations and so on. They respond, or at least one of them responded the other day by saying that, what do you expect countries like Saudi Arabia, countries of the Middle East, or even Nigeria or Venezuela or Mexico to do if they leave their fossil fuel in the ground, in the earth, as stranded assets? What happens to these economies? You will have, you know, in the short run, and if the target is, let's say, 2050, and in many cases we want fossil fuels to become stranded assets as soon as 2028 or 2030, depending on what version of the Green New Deal one buys into. So what happens to these societies, even if we could somehow get, you know, a global agreement that we are not going to use fossil fuel anymore, or we're going to use it very, very sparingly? There would need to be economic readjustments across a large number of fossil fuel producing economies, Russia among them. So we are seeing that even where we need self-interest based international cooperation, that is not happening. Here we would need to go beyond that and somehow sustain these economies, stop the Russians trekking into Ukraine and beyond, stop the Nigerians going across the Sahara into Libya and into the Mediterranean, stop the Mexicans trying to climb over walls. So what does the world do if that kind of a situation were to arise? We were to actually leave fossil fuel as a stranded asset. Where do you see the international cooperation coming from? And what would be the magnitude of the international maybe bailout that these economies would need? Anatol?
Well, I mean, the first thing to recognize is that, of course, compared to the countries that will be badly affected by climate change, the number of oil-producing countries is small. So, I mean, helping them economically is a smaller issue than, dealing with, what we'll have to deal with if climate change gets completely out of hand. The other thing is, one does, I think, and now you can make allowances here for the fact that I now work in Qatar, which of course produces now mostly gas and not oil. But one does, I think, among the fossil fuels have to make a certain distinction, in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas they produce. I mean, clearly the biggest priority is to reduce coal. And of course, that also means not ensuring that reducing dependence on oil does not increase the use of coal in places like India. But coal first, then of course oil is reducing oil consumption is critical. I don't believe myself that it will be possible, certainly not in the next decade or so, to eliminate gas. Because, of course, if you look around the world, so many countries have completely retooled their energy systems around gas. That will have to come, but it will come rather later. In other words, one's not talking about a complete abolition of of oil and gas overnight. This will take place will have to take place over the next 2 generations, which hopefully will give most of the countries concerned the ability to adapt. Because in the case of Russia, for example, Russia, of course, produces oil, but gas is even more important. So for some time, Russia's gas revenue will continue. And of course, it must be recognized that Russia, even Iran, has larger economies beyond the energy sector. Adaptation in these cases is possible. In other cases, of course, yes. Saudi Arabia, although they have, of course, a great deal of money stashed away, Nigeria, Venezuela, the impact will be great. Though it must also be said, of course, in many cases, these countries have not used their energy revenues well. And in some cases, of course, in Nigeria, also in Angola, the profits of these enormous energy sectors have overwhelmingly been stolen in many cases, by elites. So it's not that necessarily, all of this oil and gas production has necessarily actually served the nations concerned as a whole, as opposed to their ruling classes. But yes, I mean, I recognize the problem, but I still think it would be easier for the world to try to hold together the energy producers as we reduce our energy dependency.
We lost your voice, Anatol.
Sorry, it'd be easier to help the fossil fuel producers than it would be much easier to help them than to try to contain the economic and social effects of climate change on the world as a whole.
And who would do that helping? So we're clearly thinking of some kind of a plan, some kind of a Marshall Plan or whatever one wants to call it. So that again takes us back to some kind of a global fund being set up by the rich countries to provide for a transition to these countries. So is that what you're thinking of?
A global fund, yes, but I mean, if one's looking at national interest, a point which has been made, and I think a very good one, is that, trying to stop migrants from Central America, by building higher and higher walls, in many ways misses the point. Why are they moving? Of course, the Marshall Plan was not an international plan, it was an American plan. And America, and I have to say under Democratic as well as Republican administrations, over the past 30 or 40 years, has really shockingly neglected its own backyard, its neighbors to the south. And I have made this point again and again and again, that it is crazy in terms of US national interests to be focusing on Eastern Ukraine or the South China Sea, while Central America goes to hell, which has a direct impact on the United States and American citizens. So yes, I would agree there would need to be international action, but in the case of the United States, there is also a case for a national program. And here, of course, geopolitics does get in the way, because China might well have a strong interest in helping to preserve Pakistan and Iran as well. But that, of course, will be for Chinese geopolitical interests, and that would be done by China. The United States, at least at present, would not favor such a plan. But I think if you look at the case of America with Central America, if you look at the case of China and Pakistan, then one can see the possibility of such aid programs also being driven by not exactly classical security issues, but still security issues.
Okay.
Salman,
Thank you.
Can
Please,
jump
Adil.
in on the energy thing a
Sure.
bit, just a bit, because I would challenge the idea of that sometimes comes from the corporate world of stranded assets. I think it's not a very smart concept. The stranded asset is a stranded asset only as long as it's an asset. Right? There's a statement attributed to many people, including Sheikh Yamani, that the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. Right? Stones are not stranded assets. We just found better things to do. And the carbon age or the coal or oil age won't end because we'll run out of coal. It's not like once we finish with it, then we'll find something else. In every country in the world, including in Pakistan, renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels. And if they are not, then you should look where this leakage is. Right? If they are cheaper than fossil fuel in the Middle East, not just in Spain, not just in Texas. Right? So this idea, let's take these countries we call oil rich. They are not oil rich, they are energy rich. And the smart ones of them figure out that as long as we control the source of energy, we'll remain rich. And if the energy mix is going to change, then the smart thing to do, again in national interest, in national economic interest, is to make sure that I have control over whatever the energy of the future is. And that's where I think for countries like Pakistan that don't have fossil fuels anyhow, the coal is bad, the oil is not there. The national interest should be to do not because India has a coal plant, I'll get a coal plant too. Right? That's cutting your nose to spite your face. It is to say, what is the energy that I can now get because it is cheaper? The headquarter of the International Renewable Energy Agency is in Abu Dhabi, which has more and cheaper oil than Saudi Arabia. So I was part of this team that when it was being decided where it would go, and I remember talking to this gentleman, he was supposedly a prince and was involved, and I kind of said to him, why do you guys want renewable energy headquartered in Abu Dhabi? And he turns around and he says, because we like being rich. And I smiled and he said, wherever the energy is, the money will be. Right? So I think this notion that we have to somehow run out of fossil fuel before we move on has already been discredited. Big oil companies are going into renewables, not because it is the right environmental thing. I think this is the strength of Anatol's argument, because of national economic interest. Right? So I think technology in energy, in some ways, I've stopped worrying about it because the energy transition is already happening. Putting up a coal plant today is like going to the market and buying a cassette player instead of an iPhone. Right? That technological leapfrogging has already happened. The whole world is dismantling them. So now, but last point on this, this does not mean that coal will go away or gas will go away or oil will go away. I think all of them will remain. Think about energy. I cannot think of any form of energy, any source of energy, with the exception possibly of whale oil, that ever went away. Steam is still there. Wood is still there. Coal is still there. So what I think will happen and is happening is that the mix changes. And you're already doing that. Each one of you has a power generator in your pocket right now. It's this thing. Right? The amount of battery power we carry every day is quite amazing. So what I'm getting at is what we are seeing in the energy transition already is moving from this about 100-year experiment where this one technology, fossil fuel, totally dominated and threw out every other form of technology. And now, whether it is with Tesla or whether it is with phone batteries or whether it is with generators or whether it is with solar or home water heating with solar, what I think we will get to is that as we have for most of our history, we will have multiple sources of power for many things. So how did your grandparents sort of use energy, right? They probably had an animal to take them for transport. They probably had something like wood or coal for heating. They probably had something like oil for lighting, right? So think of that fast forward. I think where we are heading is we will have multiple forms of energy for multiple things, and that will bring down the pressure. There's nothing wrong with coal or oil. What is wrong is the carbon part of it, right? I have nothing against oil. I just don't want carbon in the atmosphere. So I think that again is what I take from Anatol's work is that if we think smart about climate change, not just from a bleeding heart perspective, but from this hard-nosed national interest perspective, but define our national interest smartly, then maybe we can get somewhere.
Well, Anatol, really, if I could just come in. Anatol, you talk about nuclear energy being an option that the Green Movement has maybe decided just not to consider, not have on the table. You also talk about carbon capture. So what Adil is saying is that, look, we will have a period, maybe going into several decades into the future, when all forms of energy will remain available and will remain relevant. And what we need to worry about is really the carbon that is being emitted into the atmosphere. And clearly there is an absolute number that we don't want emitted into the atmosphere. It's not just the ratio. The percentage of fossil fuel-based energy could be going down as renewables come to dominate. And yet that smaller percentage could yet be producing absolute numbers that take us beyond the tipping point. So we are here worried about absolute numbers and not just the proportion. And that is where you bring in the argument or the suggestion that the Green Movement maybe needs to be more, if you like, realistic and move away from some of its ideological positions against nuclear energy and maybe even accept fossil fuels with carbon capture. How do you see that happening? What's the argument there?
Well, I am certainly critical of the kind of, fundamentalism that has affected, aspects of this debate. Yes, I mean, the blind opposition to nuclear energy that you've seen in Germany. Now, I certainly don't think that we should be building more nuclear plants of the kind that we have now. That is not my argument. I'm just saying that until we are fully in a position to replace them with new clean forms of energy, it is really a betrayal of the struggle against climate change at present to shut down existing nuclear plants, as well as being in certain countries, notably France, impossible actually if you're going to have any progress at all on climate change. Similarly, I certainly don't believe, and I say this in the book, that we should dream of carbon capture as a miraculous savior that will save us from having to do anything, to move away from fossil fuels. But equally, I don't agree with a certain fundamentalist line which says, oh, we shouldn't even think about that. We shouldn't even explore that because that is somehow, diminishing our commitment to alternative energy. So I entirely agree with Adil that we will have a mix, and some very strong arguments have indeed been made by people like Kingsmill Bond that the economics are moving inexorably away from oil, at least from new investment in oil. The question is really just one of time. If we had enough time, or if we had more time, I would actually be very optimistic about our technological capacity to deal with this question. But the great majority of the experts are telling us that we don't have that much time. We have to move more quickly if we're going to avoid some very, very potentially dangerous scenarios. And that is also why in the book I do lay emphasis on the need for state leadership. Once again, I'm not in any way attacking either the ethical corporations or corporations becoming ethical, nor am I in any way disregarding the power of the market. But I do think that the issue of time means that state leadership is essential. That if we simply leave it to the markets and the corporations, they will indeed eventually move fully to, well, not fully, but very largely to alternative energy. But they won't do so quickly enough is the problem.
Right, and you say that, that the kind of economics that we've had the last 40, 50 years, the neoliberal economics has left not just societies broken, but our whole attitude towards growth and what the objective of a collective human society should be. And there is, I think I noticed in your book, a longing for a more social, democratic, inclusive kind of politics. You talk about the social imperialism at the turn of the century in the United Kingdom, with respect to the empire and the Webbs and Bernard Shaw and so on. So where do you see that coming? I mean, do we really see that coming? We've seen a debate, yes, but there's increasing polarization within Europe, within the United States. So a lot hangs on this internal political, if you like, transition, move away from the neoliberal economics, the Friedmanite worldview towards a different kind of economics. And the kind of change that you're looking for seems to me is closely linked to that kind of change in the political and economic ethos of nation states. How do you see that happening?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the book, the last part of the book is written in strong support of the idea of a Green New Deal. Of course, this is chiefly an American phrase, but in Europe as well, and indeed everywhere where it is appropriate. You probably noticed as well, though I don't, of course, explicitly say this, that Elizabeth Warren was the person I would have liked to have seen, as the Democratic candidate in the elections. That, of course, has not worked out. But I think one has seen, and I think the coronavirus economic crisis has greatly contributed to this. One is now seeing, read the Financial Times, occasionally even now read the Wall Street Journal, an awareness, including among intelligent businessmen, that we cannot go on the way that we have been going since the 1970s, that there has to be much more state action, in support of those huge parts of the population, who risk sinking into economic misery as a result of the changes that are going on. And also, of course, if we are going to win enough votes for quick action, against climate change, it is absolutely essential to convince people that this is linked with measures to defend their living standards, to defend their economic existence. Once again, I mean, the fundamentalist environmentalist line that we need to move towards degrowth and so forth, possibly that is intellectually valid. Politically, it's suicide. So yes, I strongly believe in the need for a combination of action against climate change with the rebuilding of social solidarity.
Okay. Adil, can I ask you to come in on this? There's a huge task, it seems, that the electorate in the US needs to accomplish, and then all of us, the world over. Do you see that happening? What are the pathways from here onwards?
Yeah, I am too old and I've spent too much of my life, a quarter century, working on this issue to be able to lie and say I'm hopeful. But I'm also too old to give up. Because there is no alternative. So no, I'm not hopeful, but that's why I think one should even focus more. I do think that there is a pathway. I do think there is a pathway. At the global level, I think the question of environmental justice is a very real one. And Anatol also brought the issue of time. There's another time dimension to this. Different countries will be impacted by climate change on different time scales. Right? So you hear a lot about this 1.5 versus 2. Here is the harsh reality. A 2-degree change is not going to affect the US too much. The US is big enough, rich enough, enough resources, it can manage it. But if you get to 2 degrees, if you are Vanuatu, if you are Bangladesh, if you are the mangroves outside of Karachi in Sindh, you are looking at real immediate loss now, right? So as with everything else, this is what wealth does, right? The wealthy, just like we are seeing with COVID, the wealthy will find ways to insulate themselves to at least some level of change from climate. The poor will not just countries, but within countries. So when the heat wave comes in Karachi, who do you think dies? Right? It doesn't affect everyone equally. Those who can get their air conditioner, get their hydration, climate change will affect the same way, and the poor will be hit first. The problem is the poor do not, whether they are individuals or countries, do not have the ability themselves through their actions to change the problem. That's the environmental justice dimension, which I think will remain, and that does require some form of not globalism, not global government, but global cooperation, which we have not seen. I hope that this notion of national threat can lead countries to act wisely. I do not see the evidence. The other point is on this. I did want to actually, the one thing I was hoping to disagree with Anatol on was nuclear. And not just because I'm a fan, I don't speak of degrowth, but I do think we have better options. You know, nuclear is very expensive. It's expensive in its risk, it's expensive in its money. So I think well before we go there and take on the dangers, not only of nuclear energy, but of its being used for other things, we should be thinking of sort of geothermal. We should be thinking of bioenergy, right? So there is a huge mix of things there, and that I think is what countries like Pakistan should be thinking of. If we take anything from Anatol's book, I would wish it is this: let us think of our energy interest, not as opposed to climate, right? Because till now it has been that climate is someone else's issue. We won't talk about it. It is our turn to do dirty code, as if it's some matter of national pride to have dirty code. No, we should be thinking of leapfrogging the way we did with the cell phone. Can we leapfrog in energy and jump across the dirty technologies because we are energy poor, go straight to a cleaner one? That, I think, is what our national interest discussion should be on. And our global discussion should be on pushing for climate justice.
I mean, in the case of Pakistan, there is every argument, including, of course, a national security argument for moving to alternative energy and solar power in particular. I mean, it is lunatic for Pakistan to be still so dependent on imports of oil and gas. And yes, I think developing coal plants is also a terrible mistake. On nuclear energy, I should say, emphasize that I do not believe in building new nuclear plants, unless, of course, we can come up with a wholly new kind of technology, and that is completely uncertain. I do not believe in an extension of existing nuclear technology. I just, believe in keeping it until we can, move to something else and not ditching it at once.
Okay, well, Anatol, you rightly subtitle your book as The Realist Case. So there's no need to be overly optimistic. We have a very serious situation facing us. And as Adil says, he has no evidence for being optimistic, but we can't give up. There's no other alternative. And so the question then remains, how do we build networks? I have a bunch of questions from a lot of people. And one of the central questions that people are asking is, what do we do? How do we create these networks of action, of thought, of sensitization? People still really do not place the environment at the center of their concerns, their worldview. I talk to a lot of economists who advise the government here in Pakistan, and I'm continuously surprised and shocked at how little the environment features in their plans for Pakistan's economic growth and economic future. So somehow it just seems the very learned and the very intelligent are still not catching on to the emergency that we are facing, with the immediacy of the issue. So a bunch of questions that I have with me is, I think, from younger people wanting to know what can they do, how can they network, what is the strategy?
Well, I mean, I can't remember. I think I did use the phrase in the book. I mean, very, very much following on from something that Adil said. Gramsci's famous dictum: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. In other words, one must be realistic both about the threats we're facing, but also the obstacles to action. But equally, we cannot give up. It would be a betrayal of our duty as citizens and educated human beings. Of course, in Pakistan, there is a terrible problem about collective action from below in any case, at least when it comes to progressive. So, of course, just frankly, getting things done, linking problems, linking public awareness of problems. It's not that, so many things in Pakistan, everyone knows this is a problem, but how do you render this, into state action? And I do think now, of course, I have been very much criticized for this, but one of the realistic things one has to recognize about Pakistan is that it is very difficult to exclude the military from effective action in most spheres. One may well not like that, but look at CPEC. It is very difficult to do things without involving the military. Certainly it is very unwise to alienate the military, and if you get the military against you, then it is very likely that you will not achieve anything. So I think in the case of Pakistan, the argument from national security is a very strong one, from 2 points of view. One, as I've said, it is, if ever a country in the classical security sense needs alternative energy, it is Pakistan. And there are so many opportunities to move towards this. I said this, and I've said this to everybody who will listen, in the field of aid to Pakistan, starting with the British, the Germans, the Americans. I've even said it to the Chinese. For heaven's sake, tailor your aid to alternative energy in Pakistan. What is the sense of China taking, real action against climate change at home if it is going to boost climate change by building coal-fired power plants in Pakistan, when Chinese aid for alternative energy linked, to Chinese exports of this technology to Pakistan would make sense from everybody's point of view. But I think a problem here as well, and I've said this once again in Pakistan so many times. I said it, after 9/11, when for a while the United States was providing or ready to provide large sums of money, is that it would be a tremendous help if Pakistan itself were to go to potential or actual donors, and Pakistan draws up the plans and presents it to them, rather than just sitting there and then accepting things from outside. I have advocated very strongly, when it comes to the World Bank and the IMF, the need to their programs to alternative energy and action against climate change. But once again, it's not fair to simply blame them for not doing that. This can also come from Pakistan, the proposals concerned. So, I mean, what I would say is that use every means available to you. And I know that in Pakistan, these are limited, to agitate for action about this and to bring it to the attention of people. And of course, there is a terrible disadvantage in Pakistan in that so much political power, whether civilian or military, is concentrated in a limited number of hands, and unfortunately, the input of the democratic masses is a very limited one. But then again, this does also mean that there are fewer people to convince. So, to put it bluntly, if you have an uncle in the government or an uncle who's a general, which I have found, when talking to members of the Pakistani elite, does, especially from Punjab, of course, if I may say, does very often turn out to be the case. Well, for God's sake, talk to them about it. Bring this home to them. I would say.
Okay, Adil, what should we be talking to our uncles about? Clearly for Pakistan, climate change meshes in with our water situation, the melting of the glaciers and what happens to our rivers and our sharing of our water resources with India, even the aquifers now we are talking about need to be replenished, and aquifers run across international boundaries. So what is the conversation that we should be having with those who wield power in Pakistan? Adil?
Yeah, Uncle Shankal, you can talk to them as much as you want, but first we need to talk to ourselves and have our own case so that we can convince them. And I agree with a lot of that. But, for example, the coal and the Chinese question. Is it the Chinese who are pushing Pakistan to build coal plants? Or is it the Pakistanis who are asking them to build coal plants because there are too many uncles who think because India has them, we must have them too, and otherwise our coal will go waste, right? Which country in the world right now is dismantling coal plants more fast than anyone else? China. Which country in the world is installing renewable energy more fast than anyone else in the world? China. So as far as energy is concerned, my stated goal policy has been do as China does. Just follow them, right? Dismantle the coal plant. So, but that's our decision. We can't always be blaming others for it. And I will take a little, if I can push back, Salman, on this idea that, you are right. Climate change, talking environment, climate change is a mummy daddy issue. It doesn't get traction beyond sort of a little fashionable class. Lekin you show me a Pakistani who's not interested in load shedding. That's climate change. You show me a Pakistani who's not interested in water pricing. We need to Pakistanize the climate issue. You show me a Lahori who is not interested in fixing the smog issue. You show me a person living in Karachi who is not concerned about the next heat wave, which will come. This time it will come on top of COVID. All of those, that is the fulcrum. That is where climate policy resides. So we need to take this not as a global issue. Again, this is where I find his argument compelling. As long as we see this as someone else's issue, somewhere else, and we will come to it when our turn is, we will keep making it into this fancy little thing to talk about. As soon as we start translating it into our issues, then those 9 o'clock talk shows that you are on will talk about water, will talk about load shedding, right? They won't talk about carbon in the atmosphere, which you can't see and you can't smell and you can't touch. Let me give you an example of the security issue, which is, I think, the other important thing, very important thing in Anatol's book. So people are going to get angry at me now. Every one of your viewers, I see that you have 87 viewers right now on Facebook, and there'll be more watching later, probably has on their phone these beautiful pictures of a thing called Atabad Lake. Right? We Pakistanis love it. It's beautiful, pristine, beautiful water, and all our Gora friends who come, sorry, Anatol, love taking those photographs, and we tell the world what a beautiful country this is. Here is the problem. Until 2010, there was no Atabad Lake. There was nothing called Atabad Lake. It didn't exist.
I remember.
There was a village called Atabad. That village is no longer there. Right? Now, this is not exactly climate because it was a shift, but it's the same process. If an enemy country came and one of your villages disappeared from the earth, what would you do? And if a natural disaster or a climatic disaster comes and does the same, we go and take photographs. Now, please go and take your photographs. I'm not saying don't take photographs. It is beautiful. Now that it's there, at least enjoy it. But remember what the nature is the biggest force out there, right? So we need to internalize these questions as our own questions. Again, with Atabad, it's beautiful. Take the photographs, but then also think about the force of nature. That if that can happen within a day, that a village disappears and a lake comes up, what are the type of things that will happen if we let this train go unchecked?
Right. Thank you, Adil. Thank you, Professor Lieven. We'll have to leave it there. It's been a very stimulating session for me personally, and I'm sure for our viewers, those who are watching live and those who no doubt watch later. And this is clearly a conversation that is critical and that needs to be continued. And I look forward to both of you participating in this conversation, because both of you have an interest, both global and an interest linked to Pakistan. And we need this conversation and your participation in that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.